Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
At my brother's birthday dinner, just as I was sipping my wine and trying to stay invisible, my dad leaned in close, his voice low and urgent, barely cutting through the murmur of clinking glasses and polite laughter, and he whispered, "Let's not talk about your business tonight." You know how he feels. I nodded because I always do. I play along, I play small, and I keep the spotlight on Jake. Even though we both know the only real thing he's built in the last 5 years is resentment. And here I was again, dressed nice, smiling nice, laughing at his stupid jokes just to keep the peace. Just to be the good daughter and the decent sister, and not the successful one who somehow made her little brother feel like less of a man. The restaurant was fancy, not my pick, but Jake loved the whole steakhouse thing. Mahogany booths, white tablecloths, waiters who pretend they aren't judging your wine choice, even when you clearly have no idea what you're doing. Jake had booked the private room, or rather, my parents had paid for it, and Jake had signed the reservation slip like it was his own gesture of generosity. That's the sort of thing he does. He performs, always has, and the whole family claps along because it's easier to let him believe he's the golden boy than to sit through one of his tantrums. My mother, wearing her usual pearl earrings and her forced half-smile, kept glancing at me like she was waiting for me to say something wrong, as if my very existence was a threat to Jake's special day. We were about 12 in total. Immediate family, a couple cousins, Jake's on-again, off-again girlfriend who didn't say much. And then there was Grandma Betty, 85 years old, sharp as hell, and incapable of filtering a single thought that crossed her mind. I'd told myself I would just coast through the night, let Jake have his attention, smile when spoken to, and talk about literally anything except what I spent 80 hours a week building. But of course, that's the problem, right? The thing you're not allowed to talk about becomes the only thing anyone's secretly thinking about. And in my case, it's not even that I brag about it. I rarely bring it up unless I'm directly asked. And even then, I sand down the edges. I say things like, "We're doing well," instead of saying, "We just secured Series C funding and landed a strategic deal that will scare the hell out of our competitors." I knew from the start it wasn't going to be a smooth night. Jake was already 3 beers in before the appetizers arrived, and he was starting to get loud. Not obnoxiously drunk, just that comfortable kind of buzzed that makes him think he's funnier and more charming than he actually is. He cracked a few jokes that were clearly at my expense, saying things like, "Remember when we were kids and Laura thought she was smarter than everyone? Guess that worked out." Everyone laughed, of course. I gave a tight smile. My parents didn't say a word. Dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and surface-level stories. Jake's friends couldn't make it, allegedly because they were busy, though I suspect it had more to do with the fact that most of them aren't speaking to him anymore. He has a talent for burning bridges and then acting surprised when no one shows up to rebuild them. But that's never discussed openly. My family treats his failings like minor speed bumps in an otherwise glorious ride, while mine are dissected under a microscope. If I miss a call from Mom, it's concerning, but when Jake ghosts her for a week, it's he's just going through something. I almost made it to dessert without losing my mind. That was my goal. Just get through the cake and go home. But then came Grandma Betty, sweet, unpredictable, landmine-walking Grandma Betty, who had been quiet for most of the evening, just sitting with her wine and watching us all with those hawk-like eyes that miss nothing. We had just finished singing Happy Birthday, and the waiter brought out this ridiculous chocolate monstrosity of a cake, Jake's favorite. And as the plates were passed around, conversation softened to a murmur. That's when Grandma put her fork down, tapped her glass like she was about to make a toast, and said with the brightest smile on her face, "By the way, her company was just valued at $200 million. The words hit the table like a gunshot. No one moved. No one spoke. Jake froze, fork halfway to his mouth, his smile draining in real time. My mother's face went pale. My dad stared at the tablecloth like he wanted to disappear into it. One of the cousins let out a half laugh, and then immediately shut up. Grandma, God bless her, just sipped her wine and looked pleased with herself, completely unaware, or maybe completely aware, of the bomb she'd just dropped. I didn't say a word. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I just sat there, frozen in place, looking at the family I had spent my whole life trying to please, realizing in that moment that no amount of humility or silence or stepping aside was ever going to make them truly proud of me, because pride requires acknowledgement. And acknowledgement requires a kind of honesty that my family never learned how to practice. Jake finally broke the silence. He scoffed, actually scoffed, like some villain in a bad movie. Must be nice to have rich investors who throw money at you for making an app, he said, bitterness leaking from every syllable. Some of us have to work for a living. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. That was always Jake's angle, that I didn't work, that I got lucky, that I was somehow playing at business while he was doing the real thing, despite the fact that he'd failed at 3 ventures in 5 years and still lived off of handouts from our parents. But no one called him out, not even now. My mother just gently said, "Let's not ruin the evening," and my dad tried to change the subject to sports, but no one was really listening anymore. Something had shifted. The dinner didn't end with a bang, but with a whimper. People finished their cake quietly, made their excuses, and trickled out. Jake didn't even look at me again. When I said goodbye to my parents, my mom barely met my eyes. My dad hugged me tight, like an apology he couldn't say out loud. And as I walked to my car in the cool night air, I realized something I probably should have figured out a long time ago. This wasn't just about Jake's insecurity. This was about a family that had decided a long time ago who I was supposed to be and couldn't handle the fact that I had become something else entirely. I sat in my car for a while before starting the engine, staring out at the dark parking lot, my mind racing not with rage, but with clarity. I wasn't angry, not yet, but I would be. The silence that followed Grandma Betty's declaration wasn't just uncomfortable. It was suffocating in that specific way only family-induced shame can be, the kind that sits like lead in your stomach and makes you suddenly aware of every noise, every breath, every pair of eyes that refuse to meet yours. It lasted no more than 6 seconds, I think. But those 6 seconds felt stretched, like time itself was trying to decide whether to rewind or fast forward, to spare us all from what was about to happen, though of course it did neither. Just stood still, trapping us in a moment where every truth we'd all danced around for years suddenly had nowhere else to hide. Jake's expression shifted first. He went from smiling over his birthday cake to wearing a look I knew too well, that tight-lipped, wounded boy smirk he wore whenever someone dared to acknowledge my accomplishments in a way that couldn't be laughed off or diluted into a joke. He set his fork down slowly, as if the movement alone would grant him composure, but I could already see the muscles in his jaw tightening, his neck flushing red in a way that told me he was fighting the urge to explode, not just from embarrassment, but from a deep, festering sense of inferiority that had only grown larger every time I said less, every time I bent backwards to protect his fragile ego, every time our parents asked me to dull myself so he could feel sharp. "So," he finally said, drawing out the word with forced calm, "we're just saying numbers out loud now, like it's a scoreboard?" The way he laughed after that, dry, hollow, more for show than expression, made my stomach twist, because I could already hear the direction this was headed. Nobody responded right away. My father coughed quietly, either to clear his throat or to stall, while my mother began dabbing at a non-existent crumb on the table with her napkin. Her eyes fixed downward, as if willing herself to become invisible. Grandma Betty, either blissfully unaware or blissfully indifferent to the storm she had just triggered, just shrugged and took another sip of her wine, clearly unbothered by Jake's tone. "I'm just saying," she added, "not every day one of your grandchildren builds something real." And that's when it happened. The moment Jake's restraint crumbled and he let himself spiral. He leaned forward across the table, elbows spread like he was ready for a fight, and said loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear, "Real? Are we calling that an accomplishment now?" playing on computers and selling smoke to investors? The tone in his voice wasn't just sarcastic. It was poisonous, acidic with the kind of contempt that doesn't build overnight, but rather simmers over years, growing from a seed of insecurity into a full-blown inferno of misplaced anger. The cousins looked down, the girlfriend shifted awkwardly in her chair, and one of them, I think it was Lindsay, actually reached for her purse, as if already deciding she wanted no part in what was coming. I looked at Jake, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I saw someone I barely recognized. His eyes were wild, his expression desperate, like he was hanging off a cliff and convinced I was the one who had kicked him over the edge. I opened my mouth to respond, but Grandma Betty beat me to it. And God bless her for not knowing how to shut up. 3 businesses, she said calmly, holding up 3 fingers like she was listing ingredients in a recipe. She built 3 businesses from scratch, and you still act like she's cheating at life. Jake's face twisted into a grimace. He turned to our parents then, seeking reinforcement, but they said nothing, which somehow made it worse. Their silence, so habitual, so well practiced, was the real fuel to the fire. "I don't see any of you lining up to invest in my projects," he muttered, as if the absence of support was some grand injustice rather than a pattern born from failure and arrogance. "But she raises money from strangers, and suddenly she's a damn genius?" His voice cracked at the end, betraying more than he meant to, revealing the truth we all already knew but never named. Jake wasn't just angry, he was scared, scared of being irrelevant, scared of being ordinary, scared that his golden boy status had an expiration date and that maybe, just maybe, it had already passed. I didn't rise to the bait, not then. I just sat there, letting the waves of tension crash over the table, watching as the family I had grown up with pretended they didn't see the man unraveling in front of them. My mother finally whispered, "Jake, please," in that pleading tone that always stopped short of actual confrontation. And my father mumbled something about keeping the peace, but the damage was done. You could feel it in the air, like the oxygen had been replaced with something sharp. Jake pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the tile, and stood up too fast, nearly knocking over his glass. He didn't even try to play it cool. He just shook his head, scoffing again as he looked at me one last time. His eyes narrowed with something close to hatred, and said, "Yeah, well, let's see what happens when the truth comes out." Then he walked out, leaving behind his untouched cake, his girlfriend, and a room full of relatives who had no idea how to pick up the pieces. I sat there for a long moment after he left, staring at the candles still flickering on the table, thinking not about what Jake had said, but about that final line, when the truth comes out. It wasn't the first time he'd hinted at something like that, and knowing him, it could have been nothing more than an empty threat, a dramatic flourish meant to salvage a shred of dignity. But something about the way he said it, the way his voice dropped just a little lower, sent a shiver down my spine that I couldn't quite explain. Eventually, the room began to move again. Conversations resumed in cautious, muted tones. People making awkward jokes and forced small talk, pretending not to feel the crater that had just opened in the center of the table. My mother gave me a tired smile that didn't reach her eyes, and my dad clapped a hand on my shoulder like he was comforting me at a funeral. Grandma Betty just kept sipping her wine, eyes sharp and unbothered. But I wasn't unbothered, not anymore. Because I knew Jake, and if he was dangling a secret, no matter how petty or ridiculous, it meant one thing: he was planning something. And that meant I had a decision to make. Wait for the shoe to drop, or get ahead of it before it crushed me. Either way, I wasn't playing nice anymore. The phrase kept looping in my mind like a slow drip in a silent room, impossible to ignore no matter how much I tried to drown it out with logic, memory, or reason. Let's see what happens when the truth comes out. It had been 24 hours since Jake's outburst, and the chaos that followed. Yet I couldn't shake that one line, couldn't file it away like I usually did with the nonsense my brother threw into the world when his ego felt threatened, because there was a tone in his voice, something brittle but deliberate, as though he'd been sitting on something he believed could hurt me, or at the very least, reset the narrative he thought I had stolen from him. I wasn't scared, not in the way he probably hoped I would be, but I was on edge. Because in a family like mine, secrets didn't just exist. They festered, buried under years of passive aggression, fragile pride, and emotional bartering that no one ever acknowledged out loud. The next morning, I skipped my usual routine entirely, ignored the string of emails awaiting my approval, and instead found myself sitting at my kitchen counter, staring at my untouched coffee as if the surface might offer some kind of reflection or clue. I wasn't going to ask him directly. Jake didn't deserve that satisfaction. But I needed to know what he meant, what he thought he knew, and more importantly, where it had come from. Because if there was anything I'd learned from a decade of building companies from scratch, in an industry where people smiled to your face and sold you out by lunch, it was that threats are never hollow, they're warnings, even if the person delivering them has no idea what they're actually holding in their hands. The first clue came through a text message from Eric, our cousin on our mom's side, the kind who somehow floated through life without ever appearing stressed or invested in anything beyond football, fantasy leagues, and talking about his college days like they were yesterday, even though we were all closer to 40 than 20. Eric wasn't bright, but he wasn't malicious either, and that made him a perfect source, one who didn't realize the value of what he said until long after he'd already said it. He had messaged me something casual, something about how last night was nuts, and man, Jake's been wound up tight for weeks. And then he added a line that made my heart hitch. I told him he should have just asked before using your platform, would have saved all the drama. There it was, a crack in the door, not wide enough to walk through, but big enough to peek inside. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I opened my laptop, navigated to a few internal databases, and pulled up old logs, access records, beta testing participants, sandbox environments, and buried in the back end of one of our earliest experimental rollouts, there it was, Jake's email, Jake's IP, and several sessions logged under a guest development account tied to code we never released publicly. He had been poking around our prototype almost 2 years ago, back when I naively believed that keeping it in the family meant safety, back when I had asked for his help testing some UI behavior because he was good with visuals, and I thought throwing him a bone would make him feel useful. I had completely forgotten that I had granted him temporary access, and clearly so had our legal team, because the beta was informal, closed, and never intended for external use. But the kicker came when I traced the trail further and found his fingerprints. Jake had cloned elements of our early UI into a separate repo, one that was marked private but hadn't been secured properly. He wasn't just exploring or experimenting. He was building something separate, something silent, and something far too similar to mine. My hands were steady as I documented everything, every timestamp, every copied line of code, every overlapping asset. I wasn't angry, not yet, but I was sliding into that space I knew too well, the one where emotion gets replaced by precision, where betrayal turns into action, and where the people who thought I was too nice to retaliate learned the hard way that I only ever delayed my responses, never erased them, but I needed more. I needed to know why he had done it. Beyond the obvious motives of pride, ego, and delusion, that's when I decided to speak to my father. Not because I thought he would help, but because if Jake had been working in the shadows, there was a good chance someone had given him a flashlight. And in our family, my father had a long history of just trying to help in ways that usually made everything worse. We met at the diner he liked on the edge of town, the kind with burnt coffee and linoleum floors that hadn't changed since the late 80s, because my dad wasn't a man of luxury, but he was a man of control, and he felt more in charge in places where nothing ever changed. I kept the conversation light at first, asking about his shoulder pain, his garden, whether he and Mom were still planning to visit Aunt Joanne in Florida, and then I eased into it with a casual, almost playful tone. Did you know Jake's been playing startup behind my back? He flinched just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but I had spent my entire life decoding his micro-reactions. The way he tugged at his sleeve when nervous or scratched his neck when lying. He tried to shrug it off at first, said something about boys needing to try their wings, but when I pushed harder, when I laid out the logs and the dates and the overlaps, he sighed deeply and looked at me like a man caught between loyalty and regret. "I didn't think it would come to this," he said slowly, voice thick. I thought if he saw how much work it took, he'd back off. That's when I knew. He had known. Maybe not all the details, but enough. Enough to suspect that Jake was leaning too close to my work, that he had taken more than just inspiration, and instead of shutting it down, instead of warning me, he had decided to let it play out, like some twisted life lesson where I was the unknowing teacher, and Jake the student who never had to pay tuition. "Did you tell him it was okay?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "I told him to be careful," my father replied, which wasn't a denial, wasn't an admission, but it was enough. I left the diner without finishing my coffee, got into my car, and just sat there for a minute, watching the traffic go by, trying to piece together how we had arrived here, how the brother I used to protect and the father I used to trust had quietly aligned themselves against me, not out of malice, but out of desperation, out of a need to balance a family dynamic that had never truly evolved beyond childhood roles and adult denial. Back home, I sent 2 emails, one to my general counsel requesting a full audit of access logs going back 3 years, and another to my personal attorney with a simple subject line, Jake. No explanation, no context, just his name. Because if he wanted a war, even a quiet one, he was about to learn just how sharp I could fight when the gloves came off and the damage wasn't emotional. It was financial, legal, and irreversible. What truth was Jake holding on to? I didn't care anymore, because I had found a truth of my own. And unlike his, mine came with receipts. In the days that followed my conversation with my father, something in me shifted. Not in the explosive, movie scene kind of way where people scream or throw things or fall apart dramatically in the middle of the kitchen, but in a colder, sharper way that I can only describe as clarity born from disappointment. That moment when you realize not only that the people you trusted won't protect you, but that they never really saw you as someone who deserved protection in the first place. There's a specific kind of loneliness that hits when you understand that your own family, people who celebrated your birthday with homemade cakes and photo albums, have quietly decided that your success is something to be managed, muted, or in the case of Jake, outright stolen. By midweek, my legal team had completed their audit, and as I'd expected, it confirmed everything I already knew and more. Jake hadn't just looked at our early builds. He had duplicated entire branches of our product design, scraped internal documentation from Google Drive folders I'd stupidly shared during the early family support phase, and even used a few of our UX flow diagrams, documents I had created personally, in his pitch deck for an app concept so similar to ours. It made my stomach churn. He had rebranded it slightly, of course, dressed it up with a different name, tweaked the interface just enough to claim originality if challenged, but the bones of it, the code logic, the foundational user assumptions, even the monetization model, were unmistakably mine. What made it worse, what turned betrayal into something bordering on criminal, was the list of investors he had approached. My lawyer flagged 3 names on the list that matched our own seed network, 2 of whom I had personally introduced him to at a charity dinner the year before, assuming he was networking for consulting gigs or a sales role, not to pitch a counterfeit version of the very company I had spent a decade pouring myself into. It wasn't just unethical, it was stupid. And yet, as always, Jake had operated under the assumption that consequences didn't apply to him, because in our family they never had. I didn't call him, I didn't email him. I didn't march into his apartment and scream or demand answers, or throw his laptop out the window. What I did instead was simple, clinical, and devastatingly effective. My general counsel prepared a cease and desist letter, served via certified mail and email, outlining the intellectual property violations in such unambiguous language that even Jake's glorified business coach, who had no real legal background and liked to call himself a disruption advisor, would understand the gravity of what he was holding. The letter was sent at 9:01 a.m. on a Thursday. By noon, the calls started. Jake called twice. I didn't answer. He texted, "Can we talk?" followed by, "You're blowing this out of proportion." And finally, "Why are you doing this to me?" to him, as if he were the victim. By the following day, his startup's website had gone dark. Two of the investors he'd pitched had quietly reached out to my team to confirm we had no involvement with Jake's app, clearly concerned that they might get caught up in a lawsuit. One of them, a particularly aggressive early-stage investor known for his deep-pocketed but cautious approach, forwarded me a pitch deck Jake had sent out 6 weeks earlier. My name wasn't in it, but my work was everywhere, camouflaged behind new fonts and vague language. The email thread showed Jake referring to me not as his sister, but as a former collaborator, the implication being that I was no longer involved in this new pivot of our shared early vision. It was such a grotesque distortion of the truth that I almost laughed. And yet what I felt more than anything was a dull, growing ache behind my ribs, the kind that comes when you realize someone you once protected is now trying to erase you. Still, I didn't reply. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a confrontation. I knew Jake well enough to understand that silence was a more terrifying enemy than rage, because rage is loud and finite. It gives the illusion of release. Silence, on the other hand, stretches out like a shadow, always present, always reminding him that I was no longer playing his game, and that whatever move he made next, he would be playing alone. My parents, predictably, did not take it well. My mother called me the morning after the letter was delivered, her voice pinched with worry and the sort of performative heartbreak she always summoned whenever she sensed her children were at odds, in a way that might make her look like she'd failed as a mother. She asked if I really had to go this far, said things like, "He's your brother, and is this really worth tearing the family apart?" As though I were the one holding the matches, not Jake with his unauthorized access, his lies, and his ego so fragile it required the scaffolding of stolen ideas to stand upright. I let her speak, I let her plead, but when she finally paused and said, "Laura, please, he didn't mean harm," something in me snapped. Not loudly, not in a burst, but quietly, like a door locking from the inside. "Maybe he didn't mean harm," I said, "but he caused it, and that still matters." There was a long silence after that, the kind that stretches between two people who suddenly realize they are no longer on the same side of a divide, and maybe never really were. She sighed, said she hoped I'd think about it, and hung up. She didn't call again for 3 days. That weekend, I had dinner with Grandma Betty, who, to no one's surprise, had already heard about the fallout and was absolutely delighted that I was finally doing something about it. She told me stories about her brothers growing up, how one of them had forged their father's signature to get out of a traffic ticket, and how the rest of the family had spent years covering for him until the lies became more of a burden than the truth. "Don't let the lazy ones guilt the builders," she said, stirring her tea with one hand and tapping my wrist with the other. "They'll take your labor and call it luck, then cry betrayal when you tell them no." On Monday morning, a news blog that covers the local startup scene posted an article under the headline, "Promising App Idea Withdraws After Allegations of IP Theft." It didn't name Jake directly, but anyone familiar with our family or our circle would have no trouble putting 2 and 2 together. The article didn't come from me, and my legal team swore they hadn't leaked it, but I didn't care. The story was out. The truth was out, and Jake, golden boy, perpetual underdog, master of excuses, was unraveling in real time. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something I hadn't seen yet, something deeper than just code and ego and intellectual property. Because when men like Jake feel cornered, they don't just back down, they dig, they claw, they find whatever leverage they can and try to twist it into a weapon. And as much as I wanted to believe this war was nearly over, I had the sinking feeling that Jake wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. It's a strange thing when the enemy you've been gearing up to fight turns out not to be the person who spent months, maybe years, actively undermining you, but rather the one whose approval you chased long before you ever realized you needed armor in the first place. By the time the fallout from Jake's unraveling reached its peak, the investors backing out quietly, his name drifting into hushed conversations like a cautionary tale, rather than a success story, and his phone calls going unanswered by everyone who had once entertained his empty promises, I thought I'd finally reached a place of peace. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even closure in the way people often hope for, but a cold, distant relief, like I'd finished cleaning up someone else's mess without asking for thanks. But what I didn't expect, what blindsided me harder than any lawsuit or smear campaign or public meltdown ever could, was the document I found while reviewing old financial archives with my attorney, a document I hadn't authorized, hadn't signed, and hadn't even known existed, bearing my name, in handwriting that looked like mine if you weren't paying too close attention, and beneath it, my father's signature, real and unmistakable. We had requested access to every record tied to early development, contracts, agreements, NDAs, shareholder distributions, and somewhere in that stack of PDFs and scanned forms was an informal authorization granting Jake full access to our first-round investor data, platform analytics, and internal valuation models from back when we were barely out of beta and scraping together angel money to stay alive. It was a document so unprofessional it looked like it had been drafted in a college dorm room, no letterhead, no legal formatting, just language vague enough to slip through the cracks, but specific enough to give someone exactly what they needed to walk into a meeting and pretend they owned a piece of something they didn't lift a finger to build. The dates lined up with the same period my father had been helping me organize my early financials, offering advice, making introductions, telling me what to say and what not to say when presenting my pitch, always under the guise of protection, as though I needed his oversight because the world was too complicated for me to navigate on my own. I stared at that document for a long time, longer than I probably should have, trying to figure out what hurt more, the forgery itself or the fact that I wasn't surprised. And that's the part that haunts you, really, not the betrayal itself, but the realization that deep down, some part of you had always been waiting for the other shoe to drop. My father had always been kind in the way that men of his generation often are, measured, withholding, affectionate only when it wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable, proud only in private and critical in public. He was never cruel, never angry, never the sort of man who raised his voice or his hand. But he had a way of making you feel like gratitude was a debt you owed for being allowed to succeed, as if his support was a loan. And if you ever forgot to pay interest in the form of obedience or humility, he'd quietly adjust the terms behind your back. When I confronted him, I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't ask him why he did it, because I already knew. He did it for Jake, not because Jake needed the help more, but because Jake couldn't survive without the illusion that he still mattered, and I could. I had spent my whole life surviving, through school, through late nights coding in apartments with peeling paint and bad Wi-Fi, through investor meetings where I was called aggressive for defending my own work, through rejection letters and failed prototypes and anxiety attacks that no one ever saw, because I made sure they stayed hidden. My father had always known I would survive. Jake, on the other hand, needed scaffolding, so my father built it with pieces of me. He didn't deny it when I showed him the document. He didn't apologize either. He just looked tired, like he'd been carrying the weight of a lie for so long it had finally ground him down to something smaller than he used to be. He said he thought it would help Jake get his confidence back, that it was never supposed to go this far, that he believed if Jake could just get started, he'd figure the rest out on his own and let go of the fantasy. It wasn't an excuse. It was a confession disguised as rationality, and it made me sick. After that, I stopped speaking to both of them, not in a loud, dramatic, door-slamming kind of way, but in the quiet, permanent sort of silence that only comes when someone erases themselves from your sense of safety. My mother tried to intervene, of course, saying things like, "You can't stay angry forever," and "He's still your father." But even she didn't have the energy to defend what he'd done. And deep down, I think she always knew that their version of love had a hierarchy, and I had never been at the top. 3 weeks later, without fanfare or public announcement, I quietly bought the building my parents were renting from, the same modest duplex they'd lived in since selling the family home after retirement. I did it through an LLC, clean and quiet, no flags, no drama. And once the paperwork cleared, I had my attorney issue a non-renewal notice through the property manager. Not eviction, not a threat, just a reminder. The same daughter they had treated as a backup plan, a plan B to their son's never-ending string of attempts, had now taken ownership of the very roof over their heads. I didn't do it to punish them. I did it because I was done being the one who bent. When the 30-day notice arrived in their mailbox, my father didn't call. My mother did. She said she hoped I wasn't trying to make a point, but I told her, very calmly, that points make themselves. She cried, gently, the way she always did when she knew the conversation wasn't going her way. And when she asked what she should tell Jake, I told her to tell him the truth, that the bridge wasn't burned. It was just one way now. The final chapter came during a fundraiser I hosted a month later, a small tech gala that raised money for young women in STEM programs, a cause that felt personal not just because of what I had endured, but because of how many girls I'd mentored who still believed they had to play small to be safe. I wore a dark green dress. I gave a short speech. I didn't mention Jake or my father or the war I had quietly fought for the right to own what I built, but I didn't have to. They were ghosts now, still alive, still somewhere, but absent from the story I was telling. Jake showed up near the end, uninvited, alone, thinner than I remembered, and for the first time in my life, I looked at him and felt nothing, not hate, not pity, not even anger, just absence, like a chapter I had reread too many times and finally outgrown. He stood near the back, avoided eye contact, lingered by the wine bar like a man trying to remember what confidence feels like, and when the crowd thinned, he approached. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't admit to anything, he just asked, "Was it worth it?" I didn't smile, I didn't blink. I said, "I didn't win, Jake. I just survived you." And that was it. No grand finale, no applause, just the end of something I should have walked away from years earlier. As I turned to leave, Grandma Betty, always sharper than she let on, clinked her glass beside me and whispered, "You didn't burn the bridge, sweetheart. You just made it one way." And in that moment, for the first time in years, I felt light enough to walk forward without checking who was behind me.